plate. I've heard estimates ranging from about 15 centimeters a year to 70 centimeters a year, just crashing into South America. Okay. Now you look at this plate, and it is. Whoops. Well, there. I'm still learning how to use it. This plate extends almost the entire west coast of South America. Why this is important to us is if you look at this ring of fire, here up in the Pacific Northwest, we have the Juan de Fuca plate, which makes the Cascadia subduction zone. Okay? It's a much smaller plate, right? It's moving slower, which is why we don't have earthquakes so often. Okay? But we still have exactly the same type of earthquake that we're talking about here in Chile. A couple other earthquakes recently. There is an earthquake in Haiti in the Caribbean. This is a strike-slip type earthquake. Also, if you look at California, the recent earthquake we had in Baja, again, it's a strike-slip earthquake along the San Andreas system. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences between those and why it makes such a big difference. So if we look at, for example, we compare the Haiti earthquake, where 200,000 people lost their lives, and the Chile earthquake, where so far about 500 people are known to have lost their lives in the Chile earthquake. So the Haiti earthquake was about a magnitude 7, which is a pretty big earthquake, right? It was a shallow strike slip under an urban area, and they had extremely vulnerable infrastructure. Right, you've heard that, the poor construction practices, the lack of a modern building code, many of those things contributed to the loss of life in Haiti. In Chile, it was a magnitude 8.8 earthquake on a subduction zone covering a huge area. And just take a look at these two plots. So this is the fault rupture surface down here from the Haiti earthquake. So this is about 50 kilometers long, and it's about 20 kilometers deep. And this is the red part is where it moved the most, and the white part is where it didn't move a whole lot. And really what you want to look at is you look at this big square, and then you compare that to what took place in the Chile earthquake. That square is just this. Okay? So down in Chile, the fault rupture surface is something on the order of 500 kilometers long and 100 kilometers wide. Okay? This is why in Chile the energy released was about 500 times that of the Haiti earthquake. Okay? It lasted 6 times as long, so you can't really see this, but this is about 30 seconds it took for the fault rupture to move down to the end of the fault. Here we're talking about 3 or 4 minutes. Okay? These earthquakes they have in California, they often last 15, 20, maybe 30 seconds. Here we're talking about shaking for 2, 3, or 4 minutes. Okay? And in Chile, the other thing is that they had much less vulnerable infrastructure. Their building codes are essentially what we have here in the United States. So we talk a little bit about Chile. So this is the fault rupture surface here. Santiago Chile is the capital. It's the largest city. It's at kind of the north end of the rupture surface. The epicenter is right here in a town called Concepcion. It's the second largest city in Chile, and it's right along the coast. And then there's a town down here called Temuco, and that's a town that we traveled to. Essentially, we drove from Santiago down to Temuco in one day, and then tried to work our way back up to Santiago as part of our investigation. This is the fault rupture surface, and that's one of the things to keep in mind is the epicenter really isn't that important. The epicenter, what that tells us is where the earthquake started. Okay, and so here, certainly if you're above the epicenter, you're going to get a lot of strong shaking, but the earth ruptured all up and down this 500 kilometer stretch of the fault. And so if you're anywhere above this, you are going to get strong shaking. And actually the strong shaking extended well into the rest of the country, of this part of the country of Chile. And this map here shows you how this, the red areas are where it slipped the most, the blue areas are where it slipped less. And you can see here this line is that contact between the Nazca plate and the South American plate. So that Nazca plate is moving underneath South America. And what happens is that it builds up this pressure on the South American plate. The South American plate actually kind of sticks and it starts bending upward until it finally breaks. Parts of the South American plate drop down, parts of it come up. But when it breaks is when we get this 3, 4, 5 minutes of strong shaking. So, the earthquake occurred about 3:30 in the morning, magnitude 8.8, fault rupture surface of about 50,000 square kilometers. About 8 million people were affected from the earthquake. Now up to about 500 confirmed deaths, 800,000 people were homeless, and about $30 billion US in damage as a result of this earthquake. And this is the area of strong shaking. And so here's Santiago, very strong shaking in Santiago. When we arrived, the airport was all of the customs were intense. They just kind of piled up. We got out, on the tarmac and walked over to a tent. Went through customs. All our, the luggage was there, all by hand. Nothing. They'd evacuated the inside of the airport while we were there. So just as an example, here's a town called Carico, kind of in the middle of the area of strong shaking, well away from the coast, so it's well away from the epicenter. And if we want to look at the strong shaking, so in that town, these are acceleration time history. So this tells you how the ground was shaking in the north, south, east, west, and up and down motions. And the thing to take away here is that well inland, the strong shaking was on the order of about 40% times the acceleration of gravity. Okay? We usually talk about strong shaking starting at about 5% of the acceleration of gravity. And this is 40 times, and this is over an area of thousands of square kilometers. Okay? This is what we call an acceleration response spectrum. This is what we base all of our designs on, are these types of curves. And this black curve here is part of the Chilean design code. So this is what we designed to, okay? Very similar to the way that we would design something here in the United States, though it's specific for Chile. And what I want to point out is when you get out to this part of the graph, the acceleration, the spectral accelerations we saw were about twice what things were designed for. Okay? Same up here, about 2 times the accelerations that we designed for. Okay? Now there's always a balance between, gosh, do you design for the absolute worst case, or do you design for an average, right, so that most things will work. And this is what happens when you design for an average or above average or some median, is that you're going to have times when you go above what you're designing for. Right? There's other things in the code that try to mitigate that. But one of the reasons for the damage we saw in Chile was exactly because the shaking was stronger than they anticipated. So what was I doing there? Okay, I was asked to be part of the bridge team. It was led by Mark Yashinsky from Caltrans. He was our team leader. This is Mark right here. Rodrigo was our student. That spent the week with us from the Catholic University in Chile. We also had an engineer from Venezuela and a professor that joined us for a day also from the Catholic University in Chile. Our job was to go specifically to visit bridges, to identify areas where there was significant damage, to try to document that damage, how much movement, what type of damage there was, to use our GPS units to get the location of all of our pictures that we took. And where we needed more investigation, we had a follow-up bridge team that is actually there this week that is following up, collecting additional information. There's only a time about a week to 3 weeks after an earthquake where you can gather this information. Because you want to give everybody about a week for the rescue efforts to be over with, right? We don't want to go in and cause more trouble, right, and be a burden to the community. But after about a week, we can go down and start collecting this information. After about 3 weeks, many of the bridges are already torn down and they're starting to remove and start thinking about rebuilding. So we have this window where we can capture this perishable data where it's critical for us to learn from these earthquakes. So specifically what we did is we started out in this area in Santiago. we drove down to Temuco, which is down here, all in one day, and then we worked our way back along the coast in the epicentral region, and then back up to Santiago. And we spent a day looking around Santiago as well. And so what I'd like to do today then is go through some of the things that we saw as part of our bridge study, and then go in and talk a little bit about what we saw, the rest of our team saw from buildings, in the wine industry, some of the problems with the wine industry, from hospitals, from the tsunami, and then what are some of the implications for here in Oregon from what we learned from down there. So, this is a very typical overpass that we saw over their Route 5, which is similar, which is basically on our I-5, okay? So these overpasses, this is their freeway here. Many of these overpasses essentially rotated about their center bend. And so you can see here that there's a little offset between the abutment and the deck of the bridge. You can also see here the shear key is well, it's sheared off, okay? And you can see that this bridge girder is also failed. And if you take a closer look at a bridge like this, you can see the temporary support here. So these metal frames is what is holding up the bridge at this point. So here's that. In this case, this was about 4 or 5 feet of offset. Okay, that's really incredible, right? And if you take a look underneath the bridge, this is a different bridge. So this girder, it slid so far that the girder fell off of the seat for the abutment. And these are some seismic bars that are part of the Chilean code, and we could never really get a straight answer on exactly why they were there. And they didn't seem to work that well. That was, and I think everybody realizes that. But there's many other things that we can do to make these bridges hold these bridges together. But one of the things I want to mention about these bridges that we just saw. So if you design to the code, you're designing for non-collapse. Right? Our goal, when you follow the code, is so that you don't kill somebody by the bridge collapsing on top of somebody or a building collapsing. So these bridges performed to the code. They will have to be torn down, they will have to be replaced, but they didn't kill anybody from collapse. And that's something that we all need to understand if we're designing to the code. Okay. We also saw these are some bridges along the coast now. So this is in the closer to the epicenter, where we had much stronger shaking. This is a bridge. It was subjected to liquefaction and lateral spreading. And so here, the supports, or the bends of these bridges moved enough that the bridge segments were able to just fall off into the water. Okay, we saw this all over the place along the coast. Right? Now what happens here, this type of bridge is a lifeline facility, right? Without this bridge, the people on one side or the other are cut off from everybody else. In Tabul, we got there, I'm not sure that the government had actually showed up yet in this town of Tabul. We took a gravel road, we took about a 3-hour drive to get down there to see this bridge. And there were people living in tents, their own tents. There were volunteers bringing in water to the local community. But we saw no sign of the government, that was there to help yet. And this was 2 weeks after the earthquake. Okay, this is an example in this upper corner. This is what I do, right? These are sand boils where the ground liquefies from the strong shaking. What happens is it loses all of its strength, and you get very large soil movements. And so you see these cracks here by this bridge. Okay, in the end, we saw about 1 meter to 1.5 meters of movement toward in this case, it was the Biobío River, right, outside of Concepcion. And what happens is that you get these large movements, and you get these unseating of these bridge spans or collapse of the bridge into the river. There were 4 bridges leading into this town of the city of Concepcion. All 4 of them failed as a result of this lateral spreading, which completely cut off Concepcion from all roads to the south. Okay? In this case, they had a temporary metal bridge that was in place, and so now it was all came in on one lane. And so tremendous traffic jams when people are trying to get their lives back to normal. So some summary of the observations from the bridges. What we found is that there's kind of a key in bridge design, and we're looking at continuity. We want to try to do things to hold the bridges together. And so there's things like diaphragms that kind of go, that are transverse between the girders to try to hold the bridge a bit better together. These shear keys, the width of the seats, you saw a lot of those bridge spans just simply slipped off. And if the seats were larger, then they would move around a lot, but they wouldn't fall off. I designed a bridge in Southern California across the San Jacinto Fault, and we gave it 3-meter wide seats. So we were assuming that we'd get about 10 feet of movement across the fault, right? The bridge is going to be moving all over the place, but it's not going to collapse. It's going to be able to slide around on that nice wide seat. Okay? Here, a lot of the seats were about less than about 2 feet, had trouble. Okay, more than that, they seem to be okay. We saw a lot of localized effects from soil or from topography. The liquefaction lateral spreading, especially along the coast, caused a considerable amount of problems. And there was fill settlement everywhere, along the freeways, along all the highways, which is more of an inconvenience, right? You come in, you put a bunch of gravel down so that you can get up, there's not a bump when you get on the bridge, but that slows everybody down because you have a bunch of rock that now people are driving across. And we saw a lot of traffic as resulting just from people slamming on their brakes, slowing down because they're coming up to these big gravel patches. So now what I'd like to do, that's where we spend our time. And now I'd like to talk some about what some of our other teams did. And I'll start out with this is our building team. This is a building that totally collapsed in Concepcion. So now this is this is out of the Chilean building code. And it's very similar to what our code says. And so I just want to read part of this for you. So this standard aims to achieve structures that, A, resist moderate intensity seismic actions without damage. So if there's a small earthquake, nothing happens. B, limit damage to non-structural elements during earthquakes of regular intensity. Okay, there's going to be bigger earthquakes every once in a while, and we want to make sure that structurally the building is fine, but that we may have some things falling down that we may have to repair later. But again, relatively minor damage. And then C, prevent collapse during earthquakes of exceptionally severe intensity, even though they show some damage. Okay, prevent collapse is the key part here, right? We just don't want them to collapse. We may have to tear down the building afterward. This is the same thing that we do here in the United States. So, and these provisions, this is basically based on the American Concrete Institute. It's the same code that we use here, though they modified it in unfortunately, some provisions were taken out due to their good performance in the 1985 earthquake. But the provisions they took out probably could have helped them in this one. Okay. So how did buildings perform overall? Really only 4 buildings collapsed and about 50 have to be totally demolished. Okay. Out of the several thousand buildings there are, that's really not that bad. I mean, so for the 3-story or taller, that's only about a 0.5%. And buildings 9 stories or taller, that's almost 3% of the buildings. Okay. Now, in civil and construction engineering, the community sees that as a failure, right? If you're making television sets, you kind of go through the math and say, okay, well, you know what, if we can do this process for this much, and if people have to bring back 1 out of 100, well, we'll tolerate that and put it into our cost structure, right? But anytime that we have some sort of failure like this, it generally costs people their lives. And so I think that if we had this type of performance in the United States, I think that would be totally unacceptable. That's the same way that people in Chile believe. So our standard is much, much higher because we're protecting the public, right, as civil and construction engineers. So I just want to show you, this is very typical of the damage that we saw. This is in Santiago. This is looks like a 15-story building. And where we see the damage typically is in the basements. And what happens is that in Chile they use a lot of walls, but the walls over time have kind of gotten relatively thin, and they also make room in the basement for parking. And so the walls get a little bit smaller. So what happens is you get a lot of axial load in those basement walls, and you can see that this building that we were just looking at is being held up by these temporary posts here, and this wall essentially has lost its ability to support the structure. Okay. These walls, one of the things you want to look at, you look at the amount of reinforcing steel, you can see that it's pretty small and pretty far apart. Take a closer look. You can see that these splices are kind of coming undone here. You can see that this rebar is bent. It's actually yielded. Okay? And if we look at the end of that wall, you can see here that this confining bars have just basically pulled apart. Okay? So what we found, if you look at the structure, the buildings, first, the earthquake demand was much higher than what the codes called for, okay, in these cases. But these slender walls were often in the basements. They also made them a little bit, squeezed a little bit more room for parking. It caused quite a bit of problems. And they had the absence of confinement reinforcement. And that confinement reinforcement, if you're able to have these transverse rebars hold that core concrete together, you're going to get much better performance. But once you start losing that core concrete, you lose your ability of that wall to support, the 15, 20-story building. Something else that is very important, and I think it's something that all of us need to be aware of, and something that we're carrying out research on here in the United States, is the performance of what we call non-structural components. Okay, here's an air conditioner unit that has fallen, came out of the ceiling and fallen down onto the floor. Their practice in Chile is very similar to our practice here, where we have codes, but they're not really enforced all that closely for these non-structural components. So these are the heaters, these are the pipes, this is the TV sitting on the wall behind you folks over there. Now, what happens here, so even if your building performs in the earthquake, and even if you have no structural damage, right? If you're a business, if you don't pay attention to the non-structural components, you're going to be out of business, right? All your computers are going to be down, your electric lines, all your files. And so if we designed a code, we're looking at protecting life safety and non-collapse. If you're a business, you got to make a conscious decision, what do I want to do the day after the earthquake? All right? And then it comes to these non-structural components, and we'll talk a little bit more about these when we get into the hospitals, and it has a huge impact on these types of lifeline facilities. Okay, the wine industry. They have about $2 billion of sales annually, and about estimates of up to 20% of their 2009 harvest was lost as a result of this earthquake. Okay? I read some articles today, they're kind of downplaying it. They said, well, it was a bumper year anyway, it was no big deal, it wasn't that big of a deal. But it really hit specific wineries very, very hard. And a couple things that we want to look at. So one, you have these large stainless steel fermentation tanks, I'm sure very similar to what we use here in Oregon in our wine industry. And they have these leveling screws here, or these legs. Okay, so what happens is that these tanks, they end up, they buckle, and the spigots on the bottom just bust off. So they hit the ground, they break off, and then all the wine comes out. All right. The ones with flat bottoms work out better. But you look at this, what we want, if you're making wine, you want to get every last drop out of that vat. So you put the spigot on the very, very lowest port of the tank. That's why you have it up on legs, so you can just get that little bit extra out. And these people lost all their wine in a case like this. All right. Also, if you don't have any sort of seismic restraints on your barrels or your bottles, you're just going to lose product in broken bottles. Now, I brought a bottle of Chilean wine home with me. Every single bottle of wine for sale in the airport was totally stained with wine from these broken bottles. Every bottle I saw. Okay, hospitals. So in the area, there was about 100 hospitals that were in the area where they had this strong shaking. 17 have to be completely rebuilt. 8 had very major damage, 54 minor damage, 21 apparently were, undamaged from our team. The Minister of Public Health gave our teams access to every single hospital in the epicenter region. And it was a great opportunity for us to learn on how we keep hospitals working after events like this. So again, it comes back to these non-structural components. Pipelines breaking, file cabinets falling over. In this case, this is just one of the office records rooms with paper files strung all over the place. Okay? So we looked at this, and this is really something critical, I think, for us here in Corvallis, here in Oregon, right? So many things that we saw. One, they depended way too heavily on telephones, both cell phones as well as landlines, right? Many of the landlines went out after the earthquake, and the cell phones were overwhelmed because all the landlines went out. So they were unable to communicate outside. These hospitals were essentially cut off, right, from everybody else. I was in the Loma Prieta earthquake back in 1989. You could not get out on a phone circuit, right? So then you have to be prepared to be on your own. The evacuations, 60% of the elevators went out of action in the earthquake in these hospitals, right? If you're on the 3rd floor and you have to evacuate somebody that's in a gurney, you need the elevator to evacuate those people, right? If the elevators go out, you lose your ability to do that. Also, if you loss of power, loss of water. If you lose your ability to boil water as a hospital, you will lose your ability to sterilize equipment. And you can't perform, and this is right when we need, this is when you're needed the most, right? This is a lifeline, an emergency facility that we need our hospitals operating at. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the tsunamis. I gotta say, I was very fortunate. I did not have to go into the area where they had the heavy tsunamis. For the bridges, we kind of go to the end of the bridge. We just do a lot of driving. The bridges are out, so we get to it and then we turn around and we go back. But we really don't have to spend much time really with, I guess the people that are really suffering. So I don't know how these guys do it. Especially the tsunami areas, they're just devastated. So the maximum inundation was initially, you read the paper and you listen to the news. They said, well, it's 1 meter tsunami, 2 meter tsunami. Okay. The reason is that you're not hearing higher is because the areas where it was higher were totally devastated. And it actually takes somebody to go in afterward and measure it to figure it out. So they had some areas, they had 10 meters, right, 33 feet of water depth in some of these areas. And then if you hit like a coastal bluff or something like that, they have a run-up of 30 meters, right? That's almost 100 feet, okay? In some areas, the tsunami on the Longwan River, it went inland about 8 kilometers. What is that, 4 or 5 miles inland, okay? Now, the loss of life, was limited from the tsunami, and a lot of this is because of local awareness and good signing, right? There's signs all over the place, just like we're getting on the Oregon coast, okay? Now, the people that were killed in the tsunamis were mostly tourists, right? If you live on the coast, if you feel an earthquake, you get the heck out of there, right? And head to higher ground. If you're camping, if you're down, I don't know what, if you're along the Oregon coast at one of the state parks or camping near the beach, if you're from out of town, you may not be that aware, right? You feel the earthquake, you go, man, I should be doing something, I'm not sure what. You only have 15 minutes, right? As soon as that earthquake comes, you got to get out of it. There was one campground that lost about 100 campers, So this is I heard somebody describe these. I went to a talk on Friday. They talked about these as the fingers of God. What these are the fingers of the tsunami and where you see it. Okay? Here is the epicenter down here, so that's where you're getting these 10-meter high tsunamis. And then as it goes across, here's Hawaii out here. We had a wave there about 1 meter high. And you can see that basically the darker the color, the worse it is. And you can see that really, from this earthquake, the tsunami generated was not all that great, except right in the country of Chile. If you look at the 1960 earthquake, this is what the tsunami map looks like. And so up and down the coastline of Chile, you're getting huge waves, well over 10 meters in thickness. And you can see here, 61 people were killed in Hawaii, 138 in Japan, 32 over in the Philippines. 2,000 people were killed in Chile because of the tsunami. Okay, so this is one town, 1,500 homes were destroyed, but these people evacuated, so only 17 people were killed in this area, even though all those homes were destroyed. This is just, I mean, it just looks like shambles afterward. And in fact, what people are doing now is like pushing the piles together and burning up the debris, getting ready to rebuild. You also have to worry about impact. These are all, this is a port, these are all containers from a, containerized cargo. All containers float, even if they're packed full of stuff, they all float, and they just float into town, and they knock down buildings and run into each other. There's boats everywhere in these pictures. I mean, it's, I just don't know, really the tsunami is really devastating. Now, there are some, so the wooden homes were destroyed in the tsunami. This is a reinforced concrete building built to modern standards in Chile, performed very well. And this is kind of the idea that when we talk about vertical evacuation, right, we talk about a lot about that on the Oregon coast. So you have these windows, they bust out, the waves are able to come in, but the concrete frame is still holding. And so you can get up on the second or third floor, right, and you're away from the tsunami, but the building is still standing. And this is exactly, if you look at the city of Seaside, right, we've done studies here at Oregon State, where in Seaside, you only have about 15 or 20 minutes of warning, and if you're on the coast, you do not have time to get out. And so what they're doing is they're building these vertical evacuation shelters so that you can go up and avoid the tsunami. All right. So let's put this all into context and put it back to where, for us living here in Pacific Northwest. So you saw this picture before. This is our fault rupture surface. It kind of stretches about from Santiago to Temuco. Now that is about 600 kilometers, and that's about the same distance as San Francisco to Los Angeles, or from Seattle down to southern Oregon. Okay? So in our investigation, where we saw all these damaged bridges, we basically started in Seattle, drove down to close to the California border, and then we drove over to the coast and drove back up. Okay? This is a giant area and a giant earthquake. Okay, so we at least have something in common with our neighbors here. This is the potential fault rupture surface for our Cascadia subduction zone. All along the Oregon and Washington coast, goes up into British Columbia as well as Northern California. Okay, this is the area that ruptured in this earthquake. Okay, ours is larger. So if we look at this, so the 2010 Chilean earthquake was along the Peru-Chile subduction zone. It was a magnitude 8.8. It had the double whammy from strong shaking and a tsunami. They had modern building codes, about $30 billion worth of damage. About 500 people lost their lives. And if you look at this, now a couple things, they have a much more seismically active area than we do, right? Because they have that big, fast-moving Nazca plate moving underneath South America. So in the past 100 years, they've had 7 magnitude 8+ earthquakes. And they get them, the last one was in 1995, so just 15 years ago, and on the average, they have one of these, these are giant earthquakes, and they have them about every 15 years. Okay, so let's look at Oregon. Well, we have the Cascadia subduction zones, which is the same type of earthquake fault. We're looking at a magnitude 9, right? Which is based on the fossil record. We've had several of these over the last several thousand years. Okay, we get the double whammy of shaking and tsunami along the Oregon coast. And modern building codes are, I mean, basically we're following similar practices to what they had in Chile. Based on Dogami, for a magnitude 9 event here in Oregon, we're looking at $30 billion worth of damage. If we get hit with the shaking and the tsunami, about 5,000 people would lose their lives along the coast as well as inland. Now, we have not had a magnitude 7.0 earthquake in Oregon, at least in the last 100 years, and I really had to struggle to see if I could get anybody to tell me when the last one we had was. Okay? We did have a magnitude 9 earthquake in 1700, and the reason, and we know the date, I don't recall it now, but it caused a tsunami in Japan that killed a bunch of people. So we're able to look at records in Japan and combining that with our fossil record, our geologic record here, and we were able to pinpoint that we had this earthquake about 300 years ago. Okay? Now, the unfortunate part is that we get these earthquakes about every 300 years. When I first moved up here, it was like 500, and then I'm reading now that, well, there's some new studies, maybe 300 every 300, 350 years. Okay? That doesn't mean that we can start a clock and say, okay, well, we got 40 more years. Right? It could be tomorrow, it could be tonight, or it could be another 100 years. Right? We don't know, but we should be prepared for it. Okay, so now we come down to what can you do, right, as residents of Corvallis, residents of Oregon. I think the first thing, and this is something I'm bringing back from Chile, is you got to take personal responsibility. Okay? You have to prepare yourselves first for the earthquake. So what does that mean? You should have several days of emergency supplies at your house. You should have water. You should have food. If you are taking some sort of medicine that you absolutely need, right, you should anticipate that you're going to be stuck at home for a few days. Okay? You should earthquake-proof your home, right? You should look at, you know, if your TV is hanging on the wall, you should make sure it's securely mounted. If you have a hot water heater, you should make sure that it's strapped down. Right? You should just look around your home and avoid some of the damage that you might the earthquake's not going to happen today, so I can, what the heck, I'll leave that up. Just be prepared for it, right? The other thing is have a plan, right? You should talk to your loved ones or to your roommates and have some sort of plan on what to do in the event, well, even if it's an earthquake, even if we have a big storm, most of this stuff comes into, can help you out. Okay? But there are many people in Chile that were just totally cut off. They had to move out of their houses. And it takes time, right, for electricity to come back, drinking water to come back. Even when the water starts flowing, a lot of the lines get contaminated, and so you can't drink it, right? Because then, it's not purified. You can get disease. And there's some cases where you're just stuck, right? I'll talk about that in a second. So the other thing is you need to support earthquake preparedness efforts. Okay? First thing, you should participate in earthquake education. This is Earthquake Awareness Month. So all of you here are doing your part and that you're educating yourselves about the earthquake risk here in Oregon. Right? That is a first step. The other thing that you want to do is continue to support state efforts and national efforts, right, on mitigating these earthquake hazards. Now, Dogami, they are putting together seismic hazard maps, and those will be completed for the entire Oregon coast by 2013. It's only 3 years away, but that's coming pretty quick. All right? So we'll know at least where the tsunami hazard is along the coast. Okay? But there's other efforts here. There are 3,000 emergency facilities and schools around the state that were found to be vulnerable to damage from earthquakes. I can't remember if it's about 3,000 combined. All right. So we are working on getting those retrofitted by 2032. So that's another 22 years, right? That includes college campus buildings, it includes public schools, it includes fire stations and hospitals, right? And we have put these well down the road, okay? ODOT is currently trying to seismically retrofit their buildings, their bridges. There's a study, you can all see it on the ODOT's website. In the event of a magnitude 9 earthquake on the Cascadia subduction zone, what they predict, this is ODOT, all of 101 will be shut down from bridge collapse or bridge failure. And all of the routes between I-5 and 101 will be shut down from bridge failure. Okay? I can tell, I'm a geotechnical engineer, I can tell you all the routes are going to be closed from landslide anyway. Okay? But there's also going to be the bridge failure. And what really strikes me in the quote, it says that portions of I-5 will be open. Okay? I was hoping they'd say parts would be closed, right? But parts will be open because of bridge failure, okay? We have a lot of work to do here, all right? So, I mean, all right, I'm a college professor, but I strongly believe that you really need to support higher education efforts here, right? The innovative, this is an expensive proposition, mitigating the earthquake hazard in the state. Right, we all got to take a part. All of you, by being prepared in your homes, will go a long way to making this a safer place, right? But it's going to cost money, and you got to depend on the research that our faculty are doing to try to find ways that we can effectively use this money to mitigate this risk. Okay, just like these vertical evacuation centers along the coast. This is research that's being done at Oregon State, right? We're finding ways to effectively retrofit the bridges. All right. All of these things take money, and I think you've got to support higher education to make these innovative solutions get them into practice. The other thing is that we're teaching the next generation of engineers, the people that are designing all these buildings, and we do public education like this to try to raise the awareness of the general public. Hey, with that, I want to thank you for your attention.
All right, let's take some questions. Who's first? In the back.
Does your team have any chance to evaluate various retrofitting techniques that were used in Chile building bridges?
Yeah, the question was, did we have a chance to evaluate any retrofit techniques? We did not see any retrofit techniques. A lot of what we focused on was the standard of design. And I think the biggest thing for us, our biggest takeaway was this, was promoting the continuity in the bridge, right? So big seats, the diaphragms, stouter shear keys, to hold that bridge in place during the earthquake. Those were the successful bridges. We actually saw some newer construction that actually had a lot more trouble than the older, more robust construction.
Right here.
I was wondering, if you're a homeowner here, is there any resources at the university for extension or civil engineering or something where you could get some advice on how to improve your home survivability?
Okay. There's a tremendous amount of information on the web, and I'm just giving you some information here. Dogami is a great resource. They have I think a quarterly newsletter that really has some great tips. FEMA, EERI. If you want additional information about anything I talked about tonight, you can go to EERI or the GEAR websites. There's a tremendous amount of information that is out there, and I encourage you to take advantage of it.
Also, I'd like to add that the Department of Geosciences has a class living with earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest, which is also an online class, which talks about the basic science for non-scientists. It goes all the way through insurance and how to prepare your home, so it covers everything for the non-scientists.
So if you didn't hear that, there's a course in geosciences at OSU that is living with earthquakes.
Yeah,
in the Pacific Northwest.
And for those of you who may have additional interest, we'll post that information on the Facebook Science Pub page.
You said the Northwest has building codes like Chile does, but Chile has a long history of knowing
So a couple things. So a couple of things. You know, if you look at the earthquake risk in Chile has a long history, and you do not have to convince people in Chile that there's an earthquake problem, right? I lived in Southern California before moving up here. You don't have to convince people in Los Angeles that they have an earthquake risk, okay? They have regular earthquakes. Here in Oregon, with our last major event being over 300 years ago, it's hard to convince people that there's a risk. It's harder to convince them that there's a risk during their lifetime, right? Or during somebody's, term in public office, okay? So now, if you look at our codes, any new building codes are going to have absolutely no effect on our older buildings, right? If your building was built in 1950, unless you go back and do something, it was built to the 1950 code. You know, a lot of the problematic buildings in Chile have been shaken down over the last, couple hundred years. We have not been put to that test, right? And so it's not enough, when I lived in San Francisco for a long time, I was very concerned about earthquakes, and I was a design engineer. And I kept saying, we got to worry about this. If there's an earthquake, this is going to happen. And people kept telling me, we've been doing this for 30 years, don't worry about it, right? We could say the same thing for the last 300 years up in Oregon. All right. Now, so just as an example, ODOT, they have been following the seismic hazard in Oregon, over the last few decades. As that seismic hazard goes up, they increase their seismic designs. In their report, they indicate that in 2004, so just 6 years ago, they started taking into account liquefaction in their designs. Okay? So anything built before 2004 was not designed to account for liquefaction. Modern bridge design really started with the 1971 San Fernando earthquake. Oregon has a huge infrastructure inventory of bridges built in the 1950s and 60s. Okay?
You plan a quick description of liquefaction?
Sure. So what happens in liquefaction? It happens it occurs in loose, saturated sand deposits, like you might find along a riverbank or along the coast. And what happens is that during the strong shaking, the sand grains try to densify. They try to get, you shake it and it tries to get, denser or more compact. But the water can't get out fast enough, and so the sand starts squeezing the water and increasing that pressure. Eventually, the water pressure is so high that it can just lift the sand grains off of one another. And you get a significant loss of strength, you get liquefaction, you get these sand boils. The bottom line is that you lose almost all your strength, and you can get huge movements. Sometimes, on the order of, several meters, sometimes a quarter mile, if you're sliding on one of these liquefied layers. And it's a problem typically, near rivers and bays, kind of like where we have bridges.
Tony?
Was there a difference in the technology or code between bridges and buildings? I mean, state-of-the-art side. It looks like there was more damage on bridges than on buildings.
Well, yeah, bridge codes are really typically run by, in Chile, it's the national government. Here, it's each state adopts their own code. It's a completely different set of codes that they use for buildings. Both of them were modern, so they're using modern codes. We use a different code for bridge design than they use in California or Washington. But they're modern codes based on similar research that we base our codes on.
So it's a problem state of the art. Do we know more about building buildings than we do about bridges?
Nah, it's just that you're designing them for different purposes, and they're very very different structures, buildings and bridges. And also, if you look at like ODOT or Caltrans or the transportation agencies, they can fund research. A lot of times with the transportation, with the DOTs, our research is implemented even before we finish our final report. I mean, so the latest technology is in bridge design. buildings to change and adopt the new codes, you have to go through a very big process. You get buy-in from everybody. It may take 10 or 15 years. Where bridge design is updated almost sometimes immediately.
What constitutes a building failure? Because there was a picture up there of one of the buildings in Chile that seemed to have split down the middle. So does that constitute a collapse or just a need for restructuring?
Yeah. Okay, so the particular building that I showed that was split down the middle, it was actually on its side and cracked in two. So that one, that was a total collapse. These buildings, honestly, the buildings that are still standing, right, the one I showed with all the pictures in the basement, it did not collapse, right? So it met the intent of the code, but it will likely have to be completely torn down. So a lot of those buildings will be retrofitted. So failure, it's kind of in the eyes of the owner. But a collapse is when you get a pancake or the whole thing comes down.
Yes.
Talk about a 9.0 earthquake in Oregon. I'm assuming that's off the coast. What would that translate to in shaking and Corvallis?
Yeah, the maps I've shown show shaking in Corvallis is around 20 or 30% of the acceleration of gravity. Depending on what type of soil you're on, it could be higher than that. So this is similar to what we saw in Santiago, where they had a lot of their overpasses collapse and a lot of building damage.
We met with Scott and some of the other scientists and engineers who were around the university after the Chilean quake a few weeks ago, just to talk further about what we might do from a communication standpoint. There's a monitoring station in Witham Hill here, and Corvallis actually experienced movement from the Chilean quake of about 2 centimeters, was it, that was measured?
But very slow, so nobody could really feel it.
Scott, the city of Newport is currently undergoing a discussion around the reclassification or rezoning of some lands. You're currently familiar with that, related to the Tsunami soil classifications. In some areas are coming out to be a fair amount more hazardous than they had been thought of in the past, with implications for property values and buildings and so forth. And people are justifiably concerned about that. How well, in your science, in your work, how well do you understand the relationship between soil types and qualities of sand and clays and stoniness, et cetera, with the potential for damage leading to a community who say, this is a bad place to build, even though it might appear to be fine, but the soil just isn't going to stand up under a good shaking. How well do we understand that relationship?
Well, we are understanding it. We're understanding it more and more all the time, right? I think this is something. So if you look at coastal bluffs, okay, so we have all along the west coast of the United States, we often have very steep coastal bluffs that might be 30 or 100 feet tall. What we know is those tend to amplify the ground motion, so you might get shaking at the top of about 50% greater than what you might find a little bit inland. We understand that these types of steep coastal bluffs have a long history of failures during earthquakes. Okay, they're typically very shallow, but over time, they slowly work their way inland. I think something where engineers can be more active is what I try to do is get the information to the policymakers and to the public so they can make informed decisions. These are things that we know areas that are more likely to have problems during earthquakes. Okay, then it becomes a policy decision. What do you do about that? And that's where it's important to have a well-educated and informed public as well as the policymakers.
I just want to point out that last question came from Nick Haltman, who is also the editor of Terra magazine. If you really want great science reading, there are copies of it on the way out. Pick one up as you leave this evening. Other questions? Yes?
So does Corvallis have an emergency plan? Are there such built facilities? Are they paying attention to the type of shaking that could occur from the Cascadia plant? Is there a plan for it? Actually, I guess it's
I'll go ahead. I'm sure that there is an emergency plan in Corvallis, right? I'm sure there's one on the Oregon State University campus. There's some students here in the audience. Let me just, we visited the University of Concepcion, where their chemistry building caught fire and burnt down, and their microbiology building was survived, but it had very strong shaking and a lot of this non-structural damage. 4 years of research were lost in the earthquake. Okay, and bringing it home, that included 8 PhDs, their entire work. They had not graduated yet, and so basically they're starting over at this point. You know, so there are plans in place. I think we can probably do better, and I think that looking at where we are, looking at the experience in Chile, they also were very well prepared, but you know, I think if we had exactly the same thing happen here as we had in Chile, I don't think that would be acceptable, you know, to the residents of Oregon.
Other questions? Yes.
How have the recent fiscal problems in the state and in the local jurisdictions in Oregon affected the seismic mitigation efforts in public buildings and churches?
It slows it down. You know, we did the Dogami, working with the state legislature, was able to get some bonds passed to start this seismic the retrofit of emergency buildings as well as schools. But you just put that out over a long period of time, and so the schools will be, you know, the plan currently is to get them finished by 2032. ODOT has been working on, you know, they've been working on their phase 1 retrofit. They're going to be working on a phase 2 retrofit. But, you know, if you look at the entire Western Oregon, we're looking at something like $1 billion worth of infrastructure that needs to be fixed, you know, for this event.
Yes? Sorry. Yes, just here?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, you have to know what the building codes in the New Madrid area.
Oh, man. Okay, so the New Madrid, the question was, I haven't repeated most of the questions, but this one was, what about the building codes in the New Madrid area? This is around St. Louis, where they had a very large earthquake about 1812 that caused a lot of damage, and then nothing really since then. Okay, so this is a real sad story in that in Tennessee, some researchers recently have been looking at GPS, using GPS to monitor the movement of the ground around the New Madrid Fault. And these researchers have concluded that there really isn't a risk, okay, around New Madrid, contrary to the greater professional opinion and all the other studies that show that there is a risk. Okay. Now, I've understood that the state of Tennessee is lowering its seismic hazard because of the results of this new study. So they are getting modern building codes in the New Madrid area in Missouri and southern Illinois, but I think we took a step backward in some of these other states.
Yes.
You mentioned that with the tsunami, you can get 30 feet, and then it become 100 feet. So what can be done in order to prevent that from happening?
Well,
In terms of
yeah, so I think, part of it, right, we understand really well how the tsunamis propagate. And so you could look on the news after the Chilean earthquake, and we knew within a few minutes when the tsunami would hit Hawaii, right, and when it would hit Japan. Okay? What we don't understand as well is what happens once it hits the shore, what happens with the inundation, and we're just learning, now how do we make buildings to withstand the tsunami when it hits, right? The only way to get it, you have to go up. And either you get up in the hills or you get up in a building. And so we're looking at buildings that have breakaway for stories to allow the waves to run through. So that helps the inundation part of it, right? The 30 feet, okay? You have to be up on maybe the 4th floor, okay? As far as the run-up, that's when the wave comes, it hits the cliff or something, or a hillside, and just runs up. And that's 100 feet. I've seen slides in Indonesia where they've had run up on the order of 100 meters. 300 feet up the hillside, whole towns is totally wiped out, right? But for the tsunami, the best thing is for us to understand understand the hazard and clearly sign it, educate the public on if there's an earthquake to seek higher ground.
As you drive the Oregon coast, there are signs that say entering tsunami zone, leaving tsunami zone. Is that strictly an elevation signage at this point? Does that take other factors into account?
No, it's, for the most part, we're looking at the elevation. We make a prediction of the depth of inundation, and then we can use our GIS systems, and we can look at the area, what areas would be inundated, and we can put up the signs.
Is that a standard threshold up and down the coast, or does it change in different jurisdictions?
I believe it changes based on our on our predictions of the height in the different areas.
Any other questions? Well, please join me in giving a warm hand of applause to Scott. And please don't forget Antonio on the way out. Dr. Torres will be there accepting donations for the relief effort. Please join us here at Science Pub May 10th for our presentation on sea lions, seals, and the threats they face, and also on April 22nd at LaSalle's for the National Geographic Lecture on Earth Day. Thanks very much, and thanks for coming to Corvallis Science Pub.